What's up, it's Jacob. I just wanted to run through how to do the fork seals on an XR650R because I couldn't find any videos online and it seems like it's really complicated when you look in the manual. There's all these parts and all that, but it's actually really simple if you have a couple things, and just for the sake of making a video, it's probably going to be really shitty, but hope it helps. So we got the fork on the bench. Okay, the first trick that I found on another video online was the manual says to start at the top end, pull the cap, pull the spring, and then get this holder tool that goes down and holds the damper rod. But if you break this loose with first a breaker bar and then hit it with an impact, while the spring is still in it, the damper rod is heavy enough that it won't spin when you impact this out. Okay, so we're not using the impact gun or the power of the impact gun, we're using the speed. So you're just going to want to like bang, 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 and we want to spin the nut and not the damper rod. Okay, and the reason you do that first is because when the spring is pushing down, it just helps it to keep it from spinning. So pull this out first, drain the oil, and then proceed with the manual. So I got the cap loose, it's hand tight. I'm just going to take this out pretty much by hand. And this whole thing comes out with the washers and everything. Set it aside, tip the fork over, and start draining the oil. The next thing you have to do once you get the fork cap off here, okay, so this is loose, is take the cap off the piston rod, which is held on there by a lock nut, okay? And it is 17 millimeter, even though it doesn't feel like it wants to go on. But what's happening is the spring is forcing the wrench to turn, so it's not aligned on the flats, okay? So it seems like you need an 18. Don't put an 18 on there, put a 17 on, and then just come in and break this loose. So here's the close-up, so you can see the piston rod, the lock nut, and the fork cap are all here, and then the springs are kind of crooked. So just kind of turn it till you can get the flats in best view you can, and really just slam the wrench on there, right? And then the fork cap just unscrews off the lock nut. Oh, I'm spinning. Okay, don't lose the rings, just set those aside. Now you can take your wrench off, pull out your spring. Okay, set it aside. And then make sure you have a ton of rags. Keep everything nice and clean. This is basically what's happening here is this. Imagine the piston rod doesn't move, the lock nut moves forward to set onto the fork cap, okay? And then the assembly procedure is exactly the opposite. So you pull your spring down on the damper rod and you thread this on just until it stops, and then you bring your lock nut up to meet it and then torque it, okay? So don't smash this all the way to here. Just thread it on right until it stops and then bring your lock nut up. At this point we have both end caps off, okay? We have our bottom one, we have the top one, we have the spring out. What I like to do is lay this all out in the order that it kind of came out of, okay? Keep it clean, keeps the dirt off of everything. And now you can start pulling stuff out. Because we have the damper bolt out, the damper rod assembly should just come right out. Okay, be very careful that we don't damage the seals. Okay, that just comes out. Keep in mind that there's a spring keeper here. And then there's also a spacer that's going to come out, okay? Lay that out. And now we're ready to pull our seals out of the tube. Then the next thing you want to do is take a screwdriver and get this little metal clip out that holds in your seals. Then take your tube and slider and briskly pull it apart until you force the upper bush out. That's what's holding it in, and these seals. So there should be 4 parts. So you've got dust seal, oil seal, sort of a, I don't know, displacer ring, the upper bush and the lower bush. Okay, so if you're not replacing the bushes, which we are, you can leave them on and then take your seals off, put your new seals on, and then reverse everything coming out. While you have this off, you want to inspect the inside of the upper bush. Okay, and it should be a nice black surface. And this one's kind of pitted and sort of gnarly on the sort of the edges, so that we're just going to go ahead and replace them. I think they're about 20 or 30 bucks for the set, and then 20 bucks for, or 20 or 30 bucks for the seals. So while you have this off, I mean, just go ahead and replace these. Go ahead and clean everything. Make sure you look down, make sure everything's clean, get all the dirt out of everywhere, get your brake clean out or your solvent. Make sure everything's really clean, free of dirt. Okay, this is just a scrap stainless rod that I use to push a rag through and clean everything. Okay, and be careful not to scrape the edges. And then you can see, check through everything. Everything looks good, looks clean, ready to assemble. Okay, we're going to start with the reassembly here. Okay, you've got seals, backing ring, and your 2 bushes, which I put back on the fork tube. They have a little bit of lubricant on them, and then they're back on the fork tube. And what we're going to be doing here is let me get something to point with here. The upper bush sits in this shoulder and comes flush to this face here. Your oil seal goes in this taper, and then your dust seal goes in this taper. Okay, so and I'll show when we're reassembling that how to sort of make sure that they're in all the way, because if you don't get them in all the way, when you go to put the next one on, it's not going to drive the upper bush back on. Okay, so this is where they say, oh, you can use a PVC pipe, right? And a PVC pipe comes on. This is 1.5 inch, doesn't actually fit, and then a 2 inch doesn't fit down into that recess here. Okay, so that's where they really say you need the tool. So I have a lathe, so I kind of turn down my 2 inch pipe, and it fits real nice into that taper. Okay, and the reason that you can't use the small one, and I tried, so I split my PVC here. You could see I saw it all the way through, and then I took some material out on sort of 30 and 60 degrees or 60 and 120. So it's just easier to spread, right? And now I can slide it over and kind of tap it down. But the problem with this is if you use the small PVC, this is the seal, okay? So you have this kind of like wiper thing on top, and then a nice firm sort of thing around the perimeter, okay? And if you try and use the small PVC, what's going to happen is you're going to be slamming down on this wiper, and it's not going to seat right. So that's where the 2 inch PVC comes in. It comes in and sits right over the seal or over the wiper and shoulders onto that rigid hard rubber part, okay? So you pretty much have to either make sort of a pretty narrow range in diameter where it fits the wiper on the inside and then comes down and recesses into the tube, okay? So I would recommend buying it. I mean, it's a waste of time making shit like this when you could buy it for, I don't know, 20, 30 bucks, but a piece of 2 inch PVC does work, but you have to file it or sand it. You have to reduce the diameter so that it fits inside. So now that we have the little dialogue out of the way, let's go ahead and start assembling. So a lot of people put this in the vise. I don't like it because I don't like pounding on these tiny little features while it's in the vise. So again, make sure that now's the time to start switching to your really clean rags. Okay, so you come in here, put a little bit of lubricant on your bushes, the bottom one and the upper one. And now this just starts going in real carefully so you don't damage any of the surfaces. You put that in. Okay, just sort of align your upper bush by eye and take your slider and start to set it. Okay, you can use the ring to sort of distribute the load so that your driver catches it, and then come in. When you're driving the upper bush, what you're looking for is the bush to be below that lip here, okay? And you'll see that they're almost perfect, so just take something and feel it. If it's not below it, all around, take your driver and drive it back down some more, okay? Next, you take your oil seal, okay, where you could see the spring underneath or the recess, that goes down. And the closed end, if there's writing or if there's any sort of like stamp features, they're going to show up on the top. People say to tape this up, but mine's pretty smooth. So if it's not, if there's like a little burr, take something like 1,000 grit sandpaper and just sort of clean it up, okay? Put it in your hand, clean it up. Take off all the burrs. You don't want anything that you could feel, especially around where the triple clamp mounts. Okay, all the way up. Make sure you clean that off with a rag that you're never going to use again. Okay, then take your oil seal and carefully stretch it over the top. Slide it down. And then start it by hand, okay? And then this shouldn't take much effort at all to get down there, so you can take your slider and almost push it in by hand. Then you're gonna repeat that procedure for the oil seal, and what we're looking for here is that our spring clip groove is visible all the way around. There shouldn't be any resistance to put that spring clip in, okay? And I measured it out. And there's only about 5 thousandths tolerance between the stack up of the seals, that ring, and the shoulder to the top of that ring. Okay, so everything has to be in right, and that's why myself and pretty much every professional video that I watch, and again, I'm not a professional, but I learned from trying it myself, that you absolutely have to have a tool with that length of shoulder to get down into the tube, the inner diameter to clear the wiper on the seal. So again, maybe if it wasn't focused, I could try it again. So it has to go over that, has to shoulder on the rigid part of the seal, and then fit into the tube, okay? So there's 3 critical dimensions on this. And then the length, you just want this to go over the fork tube so that you can kind of tap on this lightly to seat everything into place, okay? Then the final step, you just throw your ring in. Before we start throwing this thing back together, let's take a look at how it works. You have your fork tube and your slider with bushings in there, one at the very top and then one on the bottom of this that slides along with it. This is what takes all of the sort of lateral load and keeping this thing straight while this is clamped into your forks, right? So this takes all of the sort of beating from braking and anything that's not axial load. Axial meaning along the axis of these 2 pieces. The fork tube inside of the slider produces almost no damping whatsoever. So when you're filling it, you'll notice you have to move this thing in and out to sort of get the oil into that cavity, but in terms of overall damping force, that's almost nothing. Inside of the damper rod assembly, you have these sort of tubes here, and all they do is take the adjuster screw from here and take that force down to the valve that's inside of here. The screw that we took out, right, the thing that came out of the bottom of the fork here, when the very first thing we did, I'm just showing it together so that you could see. So that would thread in. This collar here is just a spacer. Lay that out. And then this is what's actually threaded for this nut. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the rod out all the way, and then you can see the spring. Okay, so you've got an O-ring on this, you've got a Teflon slider here, and then in each one of these things is springs. So both of these are going to be locked inside of this tube, and this one's stationary, this one slides up and down as the suspension pushes it. Okay, and remember that both of these things are inside of this tube. And if you look close at them, there's spring washers, there's all sorts of different reliefs, and then on the bottom of it is your adjuster screw. Okay, and all that adjuster screw is tensions the springs so that as the pressure in the tube goes one way or the other, these springs bend and allow that pressure to come either out or back in. Okay, so this one's fixed at the bottom of the fork, and this one slides with the suspension again inside the tube. So that's why this one's your compression. So as this one slides down and pressurizes that chamber, or you're compressing the forks, this one here, the springs are going to allow that fluid out in a controlled way. And then once it's down and starts to go back up, your rebound adjuster essentially does the exact opposite. When this starts to pull a vacuum and your spring is pulling this back up, that's what limits the amount of fluid that could come back into that chamber, giving you your rebound control. And that's it. When you're doing these seals, you don't mess with any of these. But if you want to do a revalve or anything, that's what they're adjusting, is these two mechanisms right here. So again, zooming out, the fork cap adjuster here, all it does is go back and forth. The little needle goes back and forth, and it drives through these rods down to this valve. That's it. That's how this whole thing works. So when you're filling the oil and you're pumping both this, the fork tube, your damper rod, all you're doing is moving these things around, moving these valves to get as much of the air out as possible. That's it. The assembly of the mechanisms from this point forward is really simple. Again, everything's clean, we have our table clean, everything's laid out, we're ready to start building again, right? So, again, just to show you, see this sort of hexagonal shape recess? That's where your damper rod holder goes to engage, and then this nut threads into this thing. So what you're trying to do when you have your damper rod holding tool, while you're tightening this, you're keeping this whole thing from spinning. That's all you're doing. And that's why this impact, if you just impact it in, what you're doing is moving the nut and not the entire assembly. This one we want to carefully, just for demo purposes, I had it out, but we want to put it back in. And then we're going to put our adjuster on, or our bushing. We're going to make sure it's sealed, clean, goes back in all the way down, and we want to make sure it seats all the way down in there. Once everything's in and you see that all your spacers are aligned right and your threads are where they're supposed to be, this is where, if you had the damper rod holding tool, you could clean this, put your Loctite on, and then torque everything down. You can torque it without doing the Loctite. And one of the benefits of not having Loctite on here is you can torque it at any time you want. If you see it starting to weep, you could just retorque it. So again, most of the time on stuff like this, I don't use Loctite, but manual says to, whatever. With everything aligned, just throw it in. Leave it hand tight for now. If you feel it starting to turn, if you feel the inside starting to turn, what you can do is put in your spring and give it pressure to keep it from turning. From there, you want to take a piece of wire and wrap it around your lock nut and you want it kind of tight. There is a hole here in the bottom of in the top of the damper rod. I don't use that hole because this wire can stay on all the way through the bleeding procedure and everything. If you put it through that hole when you go and try to put your tubes back in, or just your distance collars, you have to take it out and put it back on here anyway. So just put it up here from the beginning. Okay, we've got our fork and the soft jaws in the vise, and we start filling it with oil. That was about 11 ounces. I'm going to pull up and down on my damper rod to get all of the air out. And we're right on. Threading the wire through the spring. When it's all full of oil, you have to pull slowly so that your distance collars don't move. Once everything's set, what you're going to do here is you have to pull the spring down. What I like to do is push it over onto the damper rod and let it ride up until it catches on the lock nut, and then hold it there and take your fork cap and thread it down the damper rod until it stops. Release the spring so it holds it, and then take your wrench and move the lock nut up to keep that in place. And what you're doing here is you're setting the bottom of that screw to the top of your distance collar. And that's all you're going to do. Okay, so I have it down and locked. I'm going to take my fork cap, thread it down until it stops, and then release the spring. So one thing you want to watch out for is if your fork cap hits the lock nut is not all the way down on the damper rod. So make sure that we're seating that screw to the top of that distance collar. When you feel it stop, and then move the lock nut up to set it. Once the wire's off, you can get your wrench on there. Again, remember 17 millimeter, and it might be hard. It's going to be hard now because it's loose and the nut can turn, but we want to turn that nut without turning the damper rod. This is only 15 foot-pounds, so it's nothing significant. Take your wrench off, make sure your spring is seated right, then bring your tube up and spin the tube, not the damper rod, and thread it on. And that's it. So remember, after you have them filled, remember that if you're following the procedure on me, you'd have to push these all the way, or get them all the way in so they're not leaking, get them back on the bike, and then torque them, and then readjust your compression and damping screws. And that's it.